So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Devesh Kapoor. And a little anecdote, we met Devesh and Nirvikar, Professor Nirvikar Singh at ICC at an event some 5, 6, 7 years ago. I don't know how it was. And over dinner, we were talking about the Indian diaspora. And I think, we said something like, isn't it strange that, so many of us, myself included, would never have become entrepreneurs if we had stayed on in India. We would have been engineers, scientists, whatever. We would have followed the professions. And we came here and all of a sudden we're all building companies and running companies. And maybe that's something that you all should study. And so I'm sure that wasn't the only spark, but certainly that was something that, got Devesh and Nirvikar started on thinking of, what this project could be. So Professor Kapoor is director of the Center for Advanced Study of India, professor of political science and contemporary India at University of Pennsylvania. He has written a whole bunch of books, which I'm sure you will be able to find out if you Google him. And prior to joining Penn, he held appointments at Brookings, Harvard, and UT Austin. He has a BTech and MS in chemical engineering and a PhD in public policy from Princeton University. So there you have an engineer that moved on to do something else. The book, which is The Other 1%, that's what he's going to talk about, is co-authored with Professor Nirvikar Singh, who's here, professor of economics at UC Santa Cruz, and Professor Sanjoy Chakravarti from Temple University. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Devesh Kapoor.
Thank you all for being here on a Friday evening. I just want to express my deep gratitude to Talat and Kamil. 6 years ago, I was here at ICC speaking about my last book, and Nirvikar had invited me. And that book was about immigration from India and its impact on India. And as she said, she raised this question, which we didn't have an answer to. And it is true that that's what inspired us to begin to look at this question. And it's taken us 5, 6 years. We aren't as fast as Silicon Valley. That's the nature of academia. So this book is co-authored with Sanjoy, who is a professor of economic geography at Temple, and Nirvikar, who you all know. So the question that sort of made us the two sort of big motivations behind this book. So the first is, how did a population from a low-income developing country with weak human capital become the most educated and highest income group in the world's most advanced generation, and that too in a single generation? This is a graph that shows you all immigrants sort of in the United States. So each of those countries is by place of birth. And the two extremes are, of course, India and Mexico, right? And you can see that Indians are complete outlier, both in the share of immigrants with graduate and professional degrees, as well as on family income, right? The group actually that represents Indian immigrants most in the United States are immigrants from Taiwan. That's the group in a whole host of characteristics that comes closest. But even then, even though immigrants from Taiwan have graduate professional degrees that are close to those held by Indians, their incomes are much less than Indians, right? So this is the first puzzle. It would not seem obvious because India itself is a country with very low incomes and very low levels of education in the aggregate. The second puzzle is the numbers. So in 1965, when the act was being discussed in Congress, Dean Rusk, the then Secretary of State, had to testify. And he was asked a question, if we raise our immigration barriers, there are 300 million in India, what happens if they all come? And so this is his response, where he said, by the present estimate, we'll get about 1,600 people per year over the next 5 years. In 2014, India was the largest source of new immigrants to the United States after Mexico, right? And between those very tiny numbers that were projected, what happened in those 50 years that you have this massive change, both in quantity as well as outcomes that are really quite exceptional? These are the two core puzzles that have motivated our book. So what I'm going to do is to give you, in this talk, I'll take you through 5 broad areas. One is some background about immigration to the US, some key characteristics of Indian Americans, then of course the classic story of America, which is these many streams that come in from different parts of the world and become the American river, and that's the assimilation story. Then we'll step back and look and try and understand some outcomes. I know there are some PhD students here who will question me about my causal inference, which I'm not going to do. But other than that, I'm going to give you some correlations and then give you a sense of the future, which, to be very frank, is much less bright now than when we wrote and finished this book. So the context, which is immigration to the US. This is the last 200 years of immigration to the United States. And it's people who obtain legal permanent residence status from 1820 to 2014. 1820 is the furthest date that we have data from. And as you can see, that every few decades you see a rise, you see a political backlash, there's a stop, and it's a sawtooth curve. Then after some time, again the need for immigration is realized, again it picks up, again a backlash, and this has really continued over 200 years, right? The last single biggest backlash was exactly 100 years ago in 1916, which I'll show you next, which led to that very sharp decline which you see, which lasted from the middle of World War I till 1965, right? Since then, you had this change and this very sharp increase that you see, and the political backlash which we are observing now. In this period, as the numbers changed, so did the composition of where immigrants to the United States have been coming from, right? In the middle of the 19th century and late 19th, it was what we call the Northern European wave. That's the classic huge migrations from Germany, UK, the Scandinavian countries. Then the next big wave is the late 19th, early 20th century, and that's the big immigration wave from East Europe, Russian Jews, and some from Italy. What you see, you'll see a tiny numbers which are yellow. That's the immigration from Asia, and that you see is a very small fraction that is taking place, largely from China and Japan, some from Korea, and very little numbers from India. What you see after 1965 is, of course, how the numbers from Europe drop very, very sharply. And of course, this is the great era of immigration, the Hispanic sort of immigration. But Asia now begins to emerge as in very significant numbers, and that's what happens with Indian immigration. Now, what drops in 1916 is the passage of an act which results in something called the Asiatic Barred Zone. This is a zone, this is the actual map, where immigration was not allowed from. So these were the places where they said no one from this part of the world is allowed to come to the United States. And that's really puts a brake, which does not change till 1965. Now, the great pivot, I think the Immigration Act of 1965 was driven by a whole host of concerns. Surprising as it might seem, a big impetus, of course, it coincided with the Civil Rights Act, but a big impetus of it actually came from the State Department. The State Department was very worried that the Soviet Union was winning propaganda victories in the Third World, saying that, look, the Americans think they stand for the democracy, but they don't allow you to come to their country. So it is State Department, from the view of American foreign policy, that is a big champion actually of this change. And they really didn't expect the change to have much effect. It has been one of the most profoundly altering effects on the United States, and indeed, I would argue, around the world. And it was done not with any clear understanding of what might happen. Since then, these are the 4 largest countries of origin of legal permanent residents to the United States. Mexico, as you can imagine, is by far the dominant, followed by the Philippines, then India, and then China. What is interesting is how recent is the migration from India. This is the share of the resident population from these 4 countries in the United States since 2000. These figures are till 2014. As of this year, 60% of all Indians in the United States have come after 2000. It's a very, very young immigrant population. The vast majority have come in the last 15 years. And that is a singular transformation. And what explains and what understands is, I think, at the heart of our story of our book. More Indian immigrants have obtained permanent legal residency in the last 15 years than the entire 20th century, right? That shows you the scale and the recency of this movement. It's something that has really not been noticed. And we ourselves were quite surprised when we looked at the census data. Now, broadly, in the book, we sort of break up this into 3 periods. What we call the early movers, which came from 1965 to the late 70s. That was about 12,000 per year. Between that and the mid-90s was essentially, largely it was driven by family reunification. And indeed, if it had ended there, Indian immigration would have been fairly similar in many ways to other immigrant groups. What profoundly changed it was the H-1B visa and the IT revolution that no one had predicted. And indeed, the very failures of India turned out to be a success for its migrants, because India had failed in manufacturing. So what happened was so many Indians took up jobs in services. IT was one of the few avenues. China was the opposite. The Chinese engineers had much more access to manufacturing. And so when they came to the US, manufacturing was declining. So one group had to climb up the stairs, so to speak. The other group steps onto an elevator, which basically moves them up without their having to do that much, because that sector just expanded so rapidly. They happened to be in the right place at the right time. So what are some of the characteristics of Indian Americans, right? So this is, for various reasons, we had to use parts of the census from 2012. So at that point, there were about 3.3 million. About 60% were born in the US, about 15% in other parts of the world, and 28% were born in the US. Other parts of the world, surprisingly, Bangladesh and Pakistan were much larger. We were somewhat surprised, and we thought that these were people who were born in these places prior to partition, but that wasn't the case. And then we found, work in newspapers say, the Dawn from Pakistan, where quite a few Pakistani Americans check off Indian in the US census, especially after 9/11, because of perceived discrimination. So, there are some, remember, in the census, you are, what you say you are. There isn't anything more than that. Now, what you'll see is, from India, where are the people coming from, right? So Hindi speakers are the largest group. And that should not surprise us, because that's the northern belt. Gujaratis, Telugus, and Punjabis make up the next three. But as of this year, Telugus will be the largest immigrant group, language speaker, more than Gujarati. I will show you there's been a real change. The old Gujarati Punjabi has been declining, and from the south, largely because of the IT, has been increasing very rapidly. Now, Indian Americans are outliers in three ways, right? One, in education and income. They are the highest of all immigrants. In occupation, they are hugely concentrated in one field, relatively speaking. And the third is that their immigration status, compared to all other immigrants that are coming to the United States, is much more employment-based rather than family-based. And I think our one intellectual contribution to the work on immigration broadly is that it's not just who comes to the US that shapes how well they do in the US, but how you come to the US. Your visa status has a very, very important effects on how well you do in the US. So, the Indian-born and US-born Indians are two very, very different groups. If you look at the first graph on the left, what you'll see is, for the US population as a whole, about 35% are below the age of 25. In India itself, about 47% of the population is below the age of 25. But 83% of all children born to Indian parents in the US are below the age of 25, compared to just 13% of those born in India and now in the US. Now, what that means is that the second generation is really going to hit the sort of US labor markets in the next 2 decades. And what we show in the book is that this generation is more talented in many ways and is likely to do even better than the first generation. The normal US immigration history has been what we call regression, like to the mean, which is the immigrants come below the median and over generations rise up to the American average. This is about a very outlier group that comes in above the median. A regression to the mean could only mean downward mobility. In fact, you will see the gap widening. The other thing to notice is, if you look at their education, the Indian born living in the US, about 68% have a college degree. Barely 8% of people in India have a college degree. Right then, it gives you a hint about what explains their success. It's a very selected group, self-selected, right? And it's much more educated than the average sort of American population, right? It's not surprising that you'll do well if you are so selected relative to the group you're coming from and to the group that you're coming into. It is also now a heterogeneous community. I mean, anyone who knows India knows that India is heterogeneous. So, of course, Indians in the US will also be heterogeneous. As I said, the new entrants speak different languages, live in different places, and earn more than earlier immigrants. The rise of Telugu, Tamil, and Hindi speakers, and a relative decline of Gujarati and Punjabi speakers. This is sort of the variation of income of Indians who live across different states. So just to take an example, in California, on average, families in California have income of about 67,000, 68,000. Indians in California have a family income of about 115,000. In each state in the United States, Indians in that state have higher incomes than the average income of that state. But as you see, Indians in California have much higher incomes than Indians who live in Georgia or in Texas. So the variation of income across American states is also reflected in variation of incomes of Indians across states. The second is there is variation in both education and income by ethnicity from India. The highest educated and highest income are from Maharashtra, Bengal, Tamil, Telugu, and Karnataka. Punjabi speakers have the lowest education and the lowest average family income. But note that even then, their average family income is considerably higher than for the full US population and most other immigrant groups. So the lowest one among Indians is still higher than most other groups. It's a different story, and we can talk about it, why we see this variation and what explains that. The third is spatial variation. So we've got the data by census tract of all incomes, and this is a map just showing you of New York. The richest Indians and the poorest Indians in the United States live within 20, 30 miles of each other, which is, of course, Silicon Valley and Central Valley and Long Island, Connecticut, and Queens, and in sort of New York. Now, what's the assimilation story? How do we think about how immigrants assimilate? There's a whole range of indicators that you can use to begin to think about this. One is where you live, right? This is, really, this is sort of where you live. This is about residential clustering. Think of a Chinatown. A Chinatown is a concentrated group of people of Chinese origin, right? If you live in ethnic enclaves, the assimilation is usually lower because you're not mixing with a larger group. Among all immigrant groups, Indians have the least residential clustering. They're much more widespread. So to that degree that housing tells you some indication of assimilation, it's the largest among Indian Americans. 4/5 of the Indian-born population lives in counties that have median household incomes at least one standard deviation above the mean. Right there, you get an advantage for the second generation, right? Because where you live means access to much better schools, and that access to much better schools gives a comparative advantage to the children, right? I mean, that is, given that structural inequalities in the United States have been increasing, where you live has a huge effect on your life chances because of access to different quality of education. What you'll see is in this is PUMA is a US census definition. The US census divides the country into statistical tracts called PUMAs, which are roughly about 100,000 people each. What you'll see is that the highest incomes and lowest incomes are both in New York and California, right? The highest incomes are in Connecticut and Palo Alto, and the lowest are in California, in Yuba County and Fresno, but also in Queens. Now, this is an interesting thing about occupational, clustering. If you see the most so Indians who work in the IT sector, so that's the red line on the top in software, you'll see that spatially they are very concentrated. They live in very few areas, Silicon Valley being a good example. And of course, they are the ones who came on an H-1B visa. And the H-1B visa is a work visa. You go to where you get the job, right? And because this sector is so spatially concentrated. If you look at the bottom, you'll see are the doctors. And the doctors often came on a J1 visa. And the J1 visa required them, if they wanted to stay in the US, to go to underserved areas. So you'll see them in places like Johnson City, Tennessee, small towns in the Midwest, because that was the only way a J1 visa you were allowed to stay. So you see a much more spatial dispersion of Indian doctors across the United States compared to Indian IT professionals who are residentially much more, clustered. A big part of assimilation is, of course, you tend to lose the language of your parents, right? Your felicity with the language of your parents drops across generations. And you see in each case between the first and second generation, there are, rapid drops. The second generation, of course, as you would imagine, the language spoken at home is much more English, and the language of the parents gets gradually lost. It's, of course, more in some groups compared to other groups. We've done a fair bit of work in the book on gender inequality. So we all know that India gender inequality is very severe. And the question is, do migrants bring those norms, those social norms with them? This is just one graph. I mean, I don't want to put a lot in this presentation, but what it shows you, right, is if you look at the first generation of men and women in professional jobs, men are more represented in professional jobs and manage. These are the highest income jobs according to the U.S. Census than like women. By the second generation, this changes. Women actually, the second generation women are more represented in managerial and professional jobs compared to. And in that sense, you can see the assimilation that is taking place, right? The biases that might be there in the first generation when you come get whittled away by the second generation. And what about their political behavior? We just had elections. I can't tell you how they voted in the elections, but I can tell you in the past. One is, contrary to what you might read, Indian Americans are among the most Democrat-leaning group of any immigrant group by a very long shot. About 1/3 of this population votes, because just half is naturalized, because as I showed you, so many have come in recent years, they haven't yet got naturalized. 2/3 of them vote, and broadly, these are roughly what is true of all Asian American groups. But most of them live in, of course, the demographically concentrated in states that are already strongly the Democratic, California, New York, the Northeast. So in that sense, their vote is pretty useless. It doesn't really matter. You are a Democrat in a heavily Democratic state. And so we show in the book how there are other sources of influence where they're more important, whether it's funding, congressional staffing now, with the second generation, etc. But even then, numbers matter. So this is, some of you might know, a couple of years ago, Prime Minister Modi came to give a talk at Madison Square Garden. And there were all these reports in India and here about what this meant, about the community showing up. But actually, the organizers were really not aiming that event per se at Modi or India. They were really aiming to show to US politicians that the community mattered. So what you see here is who came from US Congress to attend this event. And if their constituency had less than 0.5% Indians, the probability of a congressman showing up to that event was 2.9%. If the constituency had more than 0.5% Indians, just 0.5, the probability increases about 4 times, right? So even these small numbers matter in terms of the likelihood of paying attention to the community. We've done this, this was part of my earlier book. What you see and what I've circled is how their political affiliation changes over time. Even when they come in, the first 5 years, you find that they are largely to Democrat by a factor of 5 to 1. As you would imagine, a large numbers are undecided because they are political neophytes in the American political system. So a large number basically says that they don't know. If you see those who've been here for more than 2 decades, that number drops, but a far larger fraction moves to becoming Democrat than becoming Republican, which is surprising because they are the highest income groups. And in the US for long, the higher the income, you are more likely to report to vote for Republican. Indians are a rare exception. This is the 2008 vote about who they voted for. And you can see there is just no comparison between the votes for Obama and McCain. It's a factor of about 7 to 8 to 1. This is in April 2016. And this was about Asian Americans. I've just given you comparisons of Indians and Chinese. And you can see that, look at the support for Obama between Indians and Chinese and Asians. Again, Indians are way higher than all other groups. Their support for the Democratic Party much higher than all other Asian American groups, and about 50% more than Chinese. They both had a more favorable impression of Donald Trump and an unfavorable impression of Donald Trump than the Chinese. I asked a Chinese friend what he thought. He said, oh, it's just because Indians are more opinionated to begin with. So they have strong views on either side compared to Chinese. This was the one that was done in October, right, where we had a much better sense of where they were likely to go. And again, you see by very large margins. And if you know the voting outcome now, you can see, now of course these were intentions, so we don't know how they actually voted. But if you compare Asian Indians with all other Asian groups, by far the highest support for the Democrat Party, right? Now, so how, in a sense, do we explain some of these outcomes? I hesitate to use the word explain, but understand might be a better word. So I think very, very, clearly, one thing it is certainly not is that somehow Indians are successful, because if that was the case, India would be a higher income country and Indians would not have left India. So we can rule that out quite safely. So the first is social selection. The vast majority of Indians, until recent years, who've come are from the upper caste. You have the first selection in social hierarchies, right? The second is, of course, the exam-based system in India, which is how you essentially get screened and a selection process. And the third is the US entry system, which favors those with STEM backgrounds much more to be able to come and work in this country. In some ways, what you have here is, right, is if you take, I don't know if this is working, but if you look at, this is sort of the average human capital of someone, average American, which of course is much higher than the average Indian. But the Indians who are coming to the US are coming from the tail end of the distribution of human capital in India. And of course, their average will be higher than the median American. So you're really comparing apples and oranges in some ways. You're comparing the tail end of one distribution with the average of another distribution. So it's not surprising that they end up doing much better. But that's not the only story, right? Second is, perchance or happenstance, they happen to focus on very highly concentrated in one occupation, and which is computers, engineering, and science. It so happened that occupation has seen some of the highest income growth in the United States. So it's not just being an engineer. If you were a very good metallurgical engineer and worked in a steel plant, your salaries would increase, but gradually. But if you were in the IT sectors, the rate of growth has been much, much higher. It just so happened that far more went in that than in normal sort of engineering and sort of manufacturing. This is then the earlier one was, doctors. So this is about all people trained in India who've come to the United States since 1950. Actually, the peak was around the Vietnam War, when about 1 out of 6 of every doctor starting to practice that year was from India. It was extraordinarily high. We have in the book even looked at the ECFMG scores. We got them from, and the Indian doctors have much higher scores than all other immigrant physicians taking that exam. This has dropped in recent years. It's a story why that has occurred. But this was the first group of Indians which essentially established the reputation of Indians in the United States. And the reason is very simple. If you're an engineer, you might be doing well. In general, you do not come in contact with the public, right? You go to office. As a doctor is when ordinary people see you on a day-to-day basis much more. And this is the first time when they encountered the first Indians, they saw them actually as doctors. And so you get, in a sense, a reputational externality because of the first encounter they have. And that was the role that doctors played. The third selection is one which we know, which is PhDs. There are about 95,000 people born in India with PhDs in the United States. India produces about 20,000 PhDs per year, of which at most 10% is of the quality that is out here. So in effect, India has gifted to the United States half a century of human capital stock in PhDs. It's an extraordinary brain drain, and it is one that I think has cost India quite dearly. As you can see, in some places, in computers, etc., or in engineering, the number of Indian PhDs compared to PhDs in general is about 8 to 9 times, order of magnitude more than their share of the population. Very unusually concentrated in some specific areas. Last is how immigrants entered the US, right? So this is the data over the last decade about Chinese and Indian immigrants, and the Chinese immigrants are also very well educated. What you'll see for all immigrants, right, that if you see for Chinese immigrants, the asylum visa is an important part how they come. Whereas for Indians, it's less than 1%. And for Indians, it's basically it's family, it's work visas or employment based, and family, reunification. Now, if you come on an asylum visa, it's actually much harder to find a job commensurate to your education. If you come on a work visa, you essentially get a job straight away because that's the only way you get the visa, like to begin with. And that we find makes a big difference on your likelihood of having a higher income in the United States. Then, of course, it so happened we were lucky who colonized us. It was the same country who colonized the US. So there is a language advantage. And this is percentage speaking English very well. And as you go down all immigrant groups, you see Indians and Filipinos have the highest. And in labor markets, language proficiency does matter. Last is actually something that's interesting, which is something we all know about India. India is a very socially conservative society, and Indians bring those norms with them when they come to the United States. What you see is that families as share of households and married couples as share of families are Indians really stand out in those. They also have the lowest family poverty rate And the reason is you have much higher fraction of two-income families in Indians compared to all other groups. So these are, if you look at rates of marriage and rates of divorce, right? If you look especially on children's living arrangements, on percentage of children living with two married parents, right? The average for the US is 63%, for Indians it's 92%, right? It gives, it doesn't take much to understand that if you have two earners instead of one, family incomes will be higher. And if those incomes are higher, the sorts of places you can live, the schools you can go to, all of those things are better, right? So this is shared in India across communities and religions, this sort of social conservativeness, which adds to their other sort of advantages. Now, there have been other, of course, facilitative factors. There have been technological and policy changes in both US and India. I'll show you, US migration from India to the US is not unique in a particular way. It's unique in migration to the US, but it's not unique in migration from India. Indians have been migrating, especially in skill-based around the world, especially in the past 2 decades. Which I'll show you those. The one thing that has occurred in India hugely is the supply side. If you see at the bottom, in 1985, India had 58,000 seats in engineering. About 58% were private. In 2016, it was 1.5 million, right? It's a huge expansion. The largest expansion took place in Andhra Pradesh. Partly, Andhra's politicians were the first, I think, to realize that you could make much more money in higher education than anything else. And what we find is we looked at all F1 visa, the student visas issued by US consulates across India. The highest number by far is from Hyderabad. It's 33%, or about a third of all visas, student visas issued are. And so what this did was to create a massive supply. Most of it is, of course, of very mediocre quality, but all you need is the top 3, 4, 5%. You'll get pretty motivated students. So they do well not because of their higher education institutions, but despite them. So as I said, Indians have been migrating increasingly in skill-based, very strongly concentrated relative to Chinese in Anglo-Saxon countries. Indians are the largest migrants in UK, Canada, second largest in the US, third largest in New Zealand. In Australia, by next year, they will also be the third largest. And even a country like Ireland, they are now the 8th largest. It is a very specific type of migration. It is also the most skill-based migration to all OECD countries. This is the top countries of origin of highly educated migration living in OECD countries. That includes all of Western Europe, Japan, Canada, US. And Indians now across OECD countries are the most educated immigrants and the highest number of immigrants in OECD countries. So there's been a large migration of highly educated immigrant Indians in the last 2 decades. The US happens to be the largest destination, but by no means is it sort of unique. What's the future? Well, we thought we knew. Now we don't. So let's tell you what we said in the book, which was written before last week. So this is not our work. This is from Pew, which is a very, very respected organization that looks at some of these projections. What you see specifically, right, is if you see 1965, the immigrant groups, whites really dominated, and that's because of Europe. As you see, within 50 years of that, that's a sharp drop in whites. And as we know now, a very large increase of the great Hispanic migration. But what we see, or this was what was projected, is that Asian migration will actually overtake migration from Hispanic countries within the next 20 odd years. In part, what we're not seeing is there's a large decline in fertility taking place in Mexico. So Mexican migration has peaked. By all indications, if you create a wall, Mexican migration from Mexico to the US, net migration is actually negative. More Mexicans are going back to Mexico than coming into the US. If you create a wall, you actually increase the number of Mexicans in the US, not the other way around. But that is, so this is a sort of interesting map. This is the countries that supply the most immigrants to each US state, excluding Mexico. And you can see the flag of India. It's really quite remarkable in how many states in the south you see they are the second largest number of immigrants. Just a bit of the present and the future. By the early 2010s, Indians were entering the US in unprecedented numbers, about 110,000 through skill-based path, and about 10 to 20,000 through the usual things of family sponsorship, family reunification. But I think the future is much more uncertain. I have little doubt that the H-1B is going to be curbed, perhaps sharply, perhaps very sharply. The climate on immigration, the clouds are definitely much darker. And I think the backlash which we saw 100 years ago, there's a very good chance of it happening again. Thank you. I should say one thing. When Talat and Kamil had inspired us to work on this book, the puzzle they had raised was, how is it that so many of us who came from India from middle class backgrounds, where entrepreneurship was really frowned on, and if you said in India you're going to become an entrepreneur, it was, what are you going to do? And how is it that same group, when it came to the US, emerged so successfully as entrepreneurs? In this, so while that inspired us, you might have thought, well, why didn't I mention this in my entire presentation? Actually, we have a lot of that, and that work was done amazingly in a fabulous way by my colleague, Professor Nirvikar Singh. He's here, and if you have any questions on that, he's the person to ask. Thank you.
So talking about the dark clouds over the future due to the recent phenomena, if the situation had to change after 4 years, do you think that the dark clouds will continue to remain there, or would we see some positive changes?
I think there'll be a lot of stickiness. There is some reason to believe that there would be a decline in any case, in particular if we see the advances in AI that might really place that much of the low-end IT worker, in a sense, will be displaced by advances in AI. So there's at least been a fair bit of projections that might happen in any case. This amplifies it. And usually, once something is closed, reopening is much harder. That's usually been the case in immigration history.
Thank you.
Since you're the expert on this immigration, based on what's going on with this Trump organization, I'm hearing all kinds of things that the number of people applying to US universities, to graduate school and all that, the way we came, is going to go down. So what do you think is going to happen in the next 4 years?
So the nice thing about academics is we write about the past. Uh, whereas people in Silicon Valley make the future. So, you guys would have a better sense. See, actually, this year, the data is just out. So applicants to US universities from India took the single largest jump ever, a 25% increase in Indian students coming to the US in this academic year, which has just started. But of course, they all made their decisions in summer and spring. We will really not know it till next year. Right. So at least this year, it's been a huge increase.
But what is your projection? What do you think?
I have to say, I gave a talk yesterday at UC Berkeley. There's a student I work with in the economics, department. And he was, very much sort of integrated into the American dream. And he said that 2 days ago, his colleague and another PhD student, he went with her to MoMA in San Francisco, and she is Muslim. And they came out, and a white guy just came and spat on them. And it completely disoriented him. He had no idea. And this is San Francisco, not Oklahoma. I would never underestimate how things can go dark. I think we live when things are going well, we build our own cocoons, and I would urge the community, these are not sanguine times.
Hi. I have a slightly different question. Lots and lots of statistics have been shown by you and others that compare the Indian average income to that of the US. Has there any study been done that compares the Indian averages to averages of the United States residents who have similar backgrounds, who have similar occupations? And what does that study show? Does it show that Indians are better off, or are they actually falling behind the American who has that same background?
So if I understand you right, you're asking,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Are you, I'm not 100% sure I understood your question, but are you saying, does a doctor of Indian origin in the US have an income similar to an American doctor? Is that
actually lower?
Is it actually low? So that part, whether immigrants have a penalty or a premium relative to counterparts in the same occupation, actually Indians have a premium, except if you have a less than high school. If you have a less than high school degree, and there are Indians in the US with less than high, their incomes are less than the standard reference group used in the US Census is called non-Hispanic white. That's the reference group. And that's the reference group we use in our book. Compared to non-Hispanic whites, when you control for occupation, college degree and above, Indians have a premium. Compared to non-Hispanic whites less than high school, Indians have a penalty. And that's partly explained that blue-collar workers, you get a large income premium if you are a part of unions. Immigrants are usually shut out of unions of blue-collar workers, so they don't get that advantage of incomes. But the census is pretty clear. Indians have a premium compared to non-Hispanic whites if you have a college degree and above.
I think the question that he was asking was slightly different one. Look at the tail end of the Indians who came here, look at the tail end of the white population, and look at their salaries.
Right.
There will be a little difference. They may be making more than the Indians.
No, that might well be true. Okay, but that the census doesn't allow us to really look at that type of thing.
I came here in '65, and what people are talking about discrimination was rampant that time. And what I went through, if I tell my people, they won't even come to this country. Okay, because people who come to California don't see that issues, oh, everything is great and rosy, and they don't see what is forthcoming soon, you know. And my friend was Siddharji, he had to cut his hair to go to the neighboring city, you know, because there's only the animal from the jungle, you know.
If you look at the poll results, California is predominantly a Democratic state, and the popular vote, of course, Hillary won the popular vote more than the current electorate. So, as a matter of fact, California the highest number of votes for Hillary. Now, looking at the strength of California, you're looking at a state that's somewhere between 35 to 38 million people, over 5 trillion GDP, 1/3 of the country's GDP. What do you see the future and prospects and the strength of California, including Cal exit?
I'll skip the last part of your question. I am totally unqualified to comment on that. I think I teach a graduate seminar on immigration. And one of the things we went through an exercise last week was likely consequences. And one you could really, I think one could hypothesize, is there will be a greater sorting of immigrants in their physical locations, right? So on average, if you come compared to the past, if you have a choice, you're more likely to go to a blue state because you think it's going to be less unfriendly, at least, to immigrants compared to the deep red states. You will also see that immigrants who are already in red states, who can't really move that easily, if you're a medical doctor, you have a practice, you just can't pick up. And I think I would hypothesize that the location choices of their children will change. They're more likely to send their children to study outside the state, and the children are more likely to look for jobs outside the state. So it's not going to be something that is dramatic. It'll be gradual. But what that means is more worrisome is that what you will get is a deepening divide between red and blue, as the sorting essentially means that more immigrants will tend to come to places like California or New York or the Northeast.
I think there will be significant fights. Already the mayor of LA has refused to cooperate, giving the names of all the immigrants as demanded right now, including New York. So there are going to be some very interesting developments in the coming months. So only we will all know when we see it.
Hi, I'm
Closer.
Simerji,
Closer.
and
Simerji, closer. Yeah.
my question is on the data. If we look at people coming on H-1B, they're already qualified to earn an amount which is more than the average American income. So isn't that a bias in the data that we are already looking that it's not the Indians are earning more, it's the Indians coming are already funneling through a channel which has a potential of earning more?
No, absolutely. That is exactly our argument, that it so happens you happen to come through a route that allows you, that gives you this advantage to begin. Absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Kapoor. First of all, I wanted to say I very much appreciate the comprehensive data you have here on Indian immigrants. I think it's the most comprehensive I've ever seen, so that's really wonderful work. And you touched upon this in some of your data, but I wonder, given the largely favorable story of Indian immigration and assimilation in this country, how does that narrative fit into the larger story of South Asians, including immigrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh? And as I'm sure we all know, those numbers have increased in the last several years. So I'm just interested in your comments and observations around that.
We barely managed to write one book on Indians. I'll leave that to others. But our sense is the immigration that has increased more is from Bangladesh than from Pakistan. It is possible that the US government has been tighter on visas from Pakistan in the last 15 years. I'm sure officially it will not be said. For instance, even if you take something as simple as, one pathway for South Asians has been students, right? Now there are as many students coming from Nepal as from Pakistan. Nepal is a much, much smaller country. That, in fact, has been the fastest growing group is from Nepal, and especially students. And it could go the other way. It could be that if you are someone from Pakistan who's looking for education, you sense a certain implicit, explicit bias against Pakistanis in the US. So you're more likely to go to England, say, to study, or to Australia, right? But so we don't know whether it is choice, meaning from there, or is it the pressures from here on being slightly more strict on the visas. That I don't know.
Hi, I want to say thank you. Actually, one of my questions was very similar to what you just asked. I just was curious, maybe if you could have give us some idea for the rest of the South Asian community who's coming in, like the Nepalis that you said, are they coming into similar professions? And then I wanted to know if there's an increase in women coming in, not family-based reunion visas, but themselves coming in, and has there been a huge increase in that? And then the last thing that I wanted to ask is, our children who are born here, sorry, did I press something?
No.
They cut me off. So I wanted to know, the children who are born here, what kind of professions are they going into?
I'll start with the last one. So we see actually quite substantial changes between the first and the second generation. Sharp decline in IT, computer professions. Actually, a big increase in health related, and the largest increase is in law. It's an order of magnitude increase. There are some, we have very detailed data, including those joining the US Army. There's a little more in the second generation, but the first generation joined the US Army or the armed forces in general, more as, say, doctors and so on. And it's interesting, the service in which Indians join most the US armed forces is the Marines. Which again it's not that it's very large numbers, but that is the one that is by far the highest. And I think law is an interesting thing because I think in US politics, law has been a pathway. You go to law school, then you work in a congressional office, etc. And so I think you're much more likely to see in the second generation much greater active service in elected office compared to the first generation. So I think that's one thing. The financial sector. The financial sector, the first generation is pretty well represented, pretty well. I can just tell you what the data we have. In terms of women, we've done a lot of things, including, for instance, the gender ratio of children born. Is there a bias against girls even here? We don't observe it in the data, but you do observe it in the third birth, meaning if the first two children are girls, you still see, if the first two children are boys, they're more likely to stop having children. And otherwise they will continue until they have a boy. So it's less biased, but there is still a little bit. Where Indian women have been affected most, which is ironic, is the US visa system. Because the H-1B visa didn't allow wives to work. And the wives were as qualified often as the husbands. So if you look at the newspaper articles, it's called the depression visa for women. And because you're as qualified, but ironically, the US visa system reinforced patriarchy rather than undermining it. Because you were trapped, because you could not, so even an abusive husband, you can't leave because your visa status is linked to his, right? Only there were some changes that have been passed the past year that will give H-1B visa spouses, and they're mainly women, who will have a little more flexibility. So that has hurt them considerably in their access to US labor markets and the wider participation in broader life.
Two totally disjointed questions. One about what happened in the last election across the country with Indians running for political office. And the second one, have you done any correlation with the big Canadian cities of Vancouver and Toronto? Are they similar to what's happening in New York and Silicon Valley? I know they don't have quite the sector, but they've got a lot of technology and medicine in both those places. Is the outcome similar for Indian immigrants?
So this election, an unprecedented number of Indian Americans were elected to Congress. This is 5. And it had been 1 prior to this election. So actually now, if the Indian population is 1%, the representation in Congress is also 1%. So it's sort of, you can argue. And there is now a representation in the Senate through Kamala Harris. There's a lot more happening at state level offices, etc. But again, what we show is, we ask the question, what happened? Everything in American political science literature about your voting behavior would have predicted far more Indians being part of the Republican Party. Not part of but being supportive. And we argue that the key thing that actually affects this is actually religion. The evangelical turn in the Republican Party in the early 2000s began to turn off more and more Indians from the Republican Party. There's a big article from a Republican strategist calling them the natural constituents because they are socially conservative, the family values are Republican. Many of them are entrepreneurs who like low taxes, they don't like regulations, exactly the Republican Party sort of thing, not the Democrat. Many are doctors, a huge number of doctors who don't like tort law, which is largely, again, a Democrat thing. All of these things should have made them. It's exactly the opposite. And the key thing was religion. Because most Indians in the United States are not Christian. And the turn of the Republican Party in the early 2000s very clearly began to have these effects. So I don't have about cities, but in each of those countries in the Anglo-Saxon countries, UK, Canada, Australia, Indians are the highest earning group of all immigrants, or among the highest. That, at an aggregate, is true in all of them.
Professor, thank you for coming back
Yeah.
here. So we've noticed with a lot of European immigrant groups that it took them 3 generations to, go from, being underskilled immigrants in the labor class to having white-collar positions and more prominent positions in society, and ultimately one came into the presidency. When you look at Irish Catholics with Kennedy, and objectively speaking, most recently with Trump, 3rd generation German American, so to speak. Would you say that in your research you would say there's a high likelihood of an Indian-born American president happening in the next 4 to 5 election cycles? Realistically?
Not if he is not Christian. That I will say it unequivocally. Not if the person is not Christian. So the most successful Indians in the Republican Party are Christians, the 2 governors, right? I don't think so this country is prepared to accept that for quite a while.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for taking time. So my question is maybe a little difficult to answer, but if you look at the flow of Indians into US, let's say if it were to hypothetically stop altogether tomorrow, let's say whether for the demand side or even supply side, a lot of them actually don't want to come here now. So what would be the impact on the population here? So the rationale for my question is a lot of Indians did well when there weren't many Indians here, right?
Right.
Before in 80s and 90s. So what would be what is the purpose of your research in terms of performance of Indians dependent on the number of Indians?
I'm not sure I quite followed. Are you saying that, is the question that if it stops, say tomorrow, what's likely to happen to those here? So I think the one thing is very clear is that the big change, of course, is the second generation is very young, right? 80% plus are still not in the working age population. And they are going to hit that in the next decades and two. And that's really going to be the big driver because they are far more assimilated and they're going to be in the working age population, and that will play, and they will begin to drive the characteristics of this group to a much greater extent than new immigrants from India. So you really have to then look at the second generation and what happens to them to understand what's going to happen to the community.
My question is regarding really the results of the present election. Where does it leave us with this rhetoric of Islamophobia, anti-immigration, and also creation of jobs? To me, as far as Middle America is concerned, we could all be Muslims because that's the way they cannot distinguish. And when it comes to creation of jobs, would it really affect so many of the IT and other H-1B visa people because they're so very vulnerable to the whims of the governmental regulations and to the market forces alone? So how do you react to that?
I'm not quite sure how to react to that.
What's your prognosis on that?
I must say, I have no crystal ball. I have as little or as much as any of you know about what the future might unfold. So I don't want to sound as if I know anything beyond reasonable common sense might indicate that life is going to be tougher than it's been in the past. And, if there is economic growth, if unemployment drops, it'll be less tough. But if, after all, it's not just about the US. We are living in the world for the first time, or not the first time, but the first time in the last, in our lifetimes, where the major countries of the world, including India, are run by strongmen. Japan, China, Russia, all, and now the United States. A world run by strongmen is an unstable world, inherently. And that means there are going to be a lot more uncertainties, not just in the US, but in the world. And when there are uncertainties, there are vulnerabilities. I think that much I can say with confidence.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know that, we are kind of a product of the British colonial rule of the last 150 years. There was a indentured labor from India to countries like, Mauritius and Seychelles and the West Indies and to Africa and even Fiji. So any study on those immigrants to the United States?
Yeah, so we have that in the book. We call them the diaspora in the Indian diaspora, which is Indians not born in India or the US, which is about 12 to 13% of the population. We focus particularly on those who've come from the Caribbean, and their characteristics are quite different. Their education is less, their incomes are less. And so we have a pretty good analysis of that group. Yeah.
But most of those Indians were taken as a labor class to those
Yeah.
by French, by English, including UK, to work in the mines. That's the reason
No, they were not mines. They were largely when the slave trade ended for the sugar plantations. That was the core place where they were taken for as indentured labor.
Professor, thanks for the excellent presentation. We have a question for you on the political and civic engagement dimension. So some interesting data that you highlighted about political affiliations. Did you find much information, much data around civic engagement? And this, de Tocqueville had this, lengthy essay in his book on America on Americans being a civic-minded and community associational people. And one important dimension of kind of mainstreaming seems to be kind of being civic-minded. One thing I've noticed anecdotally is very few Indian Americans, certainly first generation, are very civically engaged. I don't know if you found much data or there's a way to kind of prognosticate on how civically engaged the Indian American community will be, first and or second generation.
So we have actually a whole discussion on that with quite good data, or not bad data, I should say. So we have a list through 501(c) of every group across the US, and we spatially map them, what they do, how Indians organize, right? Do they organize around religion? Do they organize around caste? Do they organize around Gujarati, Tamil, right? Or do they organize around the professions, right? Like TIE sort of began, or API, American Association of Physicians from India, or the hotel and the motel guys, right? So we have a very good, from other surveys, and I can only tell you what the surveys are saying, Indian are far more civic engaged than any other Asian American group. Much more so. We have a whole analysis of philanthropy as well, which has gradually been transforming, much less on religion, which was, and a much more broadening. And one key case we look at funding US universities, which was very little. It began with late 80s, 90s with the sort of 10, 100,000 gifts, then the 1 million gifts, then the 10 million gifts, and now the 100 million gifts, right? And that's sort of part of the American thing, right, of assimilation, that how norms and habits begin to resemble, because in a sense, it's a relative elite community by income. So the norms and habits of American elites, of which philanthropy has been a big part of that, is something you are observing, right? I mean, even in India, it's organization like, Pratham, for instance, its core fundraising is in the US, and they raise a serious amount of money in the US, I talked to them, and 10 years ago, if they could raise 10,000 at a gala, now they raise $1.5 million at a gala. That's the sort of thing that has been changing a lot.
So thank you very much for coming here and giving this very informative and very educational talk today. We really, truly appreciate your coming here. Thank you, Talat and Kamal, for inviting him to give a talk here. Thanks, Raj, for co-hosting this. And thank you, ICC and CHI members and guests.